Walk through downtown Houston on a Tuesday afternoon and something feels off. The sidewalks are wide and quiet. The streets are wide enough to land a plane on and about as busy. Some of the tallest office towers in the country loom overhead with entire floors dark. The lunch spots that depended on foot traffic are gone or going. You start to wonder if you missed a memo, so let's talk about what's actually going on. Because Houston is empty, and what is really happening is more complicated than it looks. The city that sprawled its way into a problem. Houston is the fourth largest city in the United States by population, with roughly 2.3 million people inside the city limits and over 7 million in the greater metro area. It covers about 667 square miles, more land area than any other city in the top 10 by population. For comparison, New York City covers about 302 square miles. Houston is enormous, and that size is the first part of the problem. The city has no traditional zoning code, something Houston likes to mention as a point of pride. Without it, development has historically gone wherever land was cheap and developers wanted to build. The result is a city that spread outward for decades instead of building upward and inward. Strip malls, subdivisions, big box retailers, and 6-lane roads stretch in every direction from a downtown that was, at least in theory, supposed to be the center of it all. That outward expansion meant the downtown core never had the organic foot traffic that urban centers in other cities developed. In New York or Chicago, or even smaller cities like Denver, people live downtown, walk to work, grab lunch at street-level restaurants, and generally animate the sidewalks around the clock. In Houston, most people live 30 or 40 minutes from downtown by car, drive in for work, park in a garage beneath the tower, and leave by 5 p.m. There was never a strong residential base in the core to carry street life through evenings and weekends. When the office workers go home, the neighborhood effectively shuts down. The highway system made it not just possible, but comfortable to live far from the center and still reach downtown. The I-10 Katy Freeway, which runs through Houston's west side, was at one point expanded to 26 lanes, the widest urban highway in the world. That figure sounds impressive until you realize it was expanded to 26 lanes because 20 lanes were insufficient. Residents voted down zoning ordinances 3 times, in 1948, 1962, and 1993, which meant nothing constrained developers from placing a strip mall next to a subdivision, next to an industrial facility, wherever land prices made it attractive. More highway, more suburban land, fewer constraints on where development could go. The result is a city whose sprawl has no uniform pattern, no obvious stopping point, and a downtown that for most of its history has been an economic destination rather than a lived-in neighborhood. What the office numbers actually say. Houston's office vacancy rate has been elevated for years, long before the pandemic. In Q4 2024, the overall office vacancy rate in Houston hit 27%, up from 26.2% the year before. Annual leasing for 2024 came in at 11.9 million square feet, the lowest total since 2009. As of early 2025, more than a quarter of all downtown office space was sitting empty. For context, a healthy office market typically runs vacancy rates in the 10 to 14% range. Houston has been living well above that threshold for the better part of a decade. Those numbers are bad on their own, but there's a layer underneath them that makes the picture worse. Real estate analysts call it the flight to quality. Tenants aren't disappearing entirely. Many are just moving from older, less attractive buildings into newer ones with better amenities, more natural light, and modern layouts suited to hybrid work. This migration leaves behind a growing inventory of older office stock that is increasingly difficult to fill. According to Chris Larson, president of Central Houston, Inc., roughly half of the downtown vacant space is essentially unmarketable because it's so outdated. It would need substantial capital investment to attract tenants, and many landlords can't justify that spend when the rental income projections don't support the renovation costs. Class A buildings delivered since 2015 are running vacancy rates around 11 to 15%, uncomfortable but survivable. Older Class B and Class C buildings are running vacancy rates above 24 to 28% in many submarkets. The Greenspoint submarket in North Houston, sometimes called Greenspoint by locals who know its reputation, was sitting at nearly 49% vacancy as of mid-2025. That is not a market that's adjusting. That's a market in structural trouble. And no amount of optimistic language in a quarterly report changes what 49% vacant actually looks like from the street. More than a quarter of Houston's downtown office space is sitting empty, and roughly half of that vacant space is basically unmarketable because it's so out of date. Chris Larson, President and CEO of Central Houston Inc., 2023, the asking rent picture tells the same story. As of late 2024, average asking rents in Houston sat at around $27 to $28 per square foot, roughly half the national average of about $55 per square foot. Houston office space is cheap, and it's still hard to fill. That combination is not a sign of a market finding its floor. It's a sign of a market trying to figure out what it's actually for. The energy sector's long shadow. Houston calls itself the energy capital of the world, and for most of the 20th century, that title came with enormous economic advantages. The oil boom of the 1970s funded a wave of downtown office construction. Glass towers went up all over the central business district, built to house the expanding payrolls of energy companies riding OPEC-era oil prices. It was a genuinely spectacular run of growth for a city that had been a secondary market not long before. Then came the 1980s oil bust. When oil prices collapsed in 1982 and again in 1986, Houston was exposed in ways that few people had anticipated. Office buildings that had been built on the assumption that energy employment would keep growing suddenly sat partially empty. Vacancy rates in downtown Houston climbed to historic highs. The city entered a painful multi-year contraction. Unemployment spiked. Banks failed. The real estate market didn't fully recover from the 1980s damage for over a decade. Entire neighborhoods built on the expectation of continued growth stalled out mid-construction and sat incomplete for years. The same cycle played out again with the 2015 to 2016 oil price crash, when upstream energy employment in Houston fell sharply after a fracking-fueled growth period. The city had added energy jobs at a furious pace from 2009 to 2014. Upstream employment grew by more than 40% in that 5-year window. When oil prices tanked again in 2015, that growth reversed almost overnight. Downtown vacancy, which had been climbing even before the crash, accelerated further. From 2016 through 2023, energy and mining employment in Houston fell by about 2% overall. The industry was producing more oil with fewer people, driven by automation and efficiency improvements that eliminated jobs even as production rose. Houston had spent decades building office infrastructure to serve an industry steadily requiring less office space per barrel of oil produced. That is a structural shift, and the kinds of structural shifts that accumulate over 40 years don't reverse themselves in a single leasing cycle. The energy companies that remain are still major employers and major tenants, but the math of needing fewer humans to produce the same amount of energy is not a trend that runs backward. The overbuilding legacy that never fully cleared. One thing that makes Houston's current office situation different from most American cities is that the problem is not new. The city has been dealing with elevated office vacancy in some form for most of the period since the 1980s oil bust, with brief stretches of recovery interrupted by each subsequent downturn. Every boom cycle generated new construction. Every bust left behind buildings that couldn't be fully leased. By the time the pandemic arrived, the Houston office market was already carrying a structural oversupply that predated COVID-19 by decades. When the fracking boom of the early 2010s pushed energy employment up sharply, developers responded by building new Class A office space. Several significant towers were added to the Houston skyline between 2012 and 2016. Some were pre-leased before completion. Others came to market just as the 2015 oil price crash hit, and they've been competing for tenants alongside older buildings ever since, making a crowded market even more competitive. The new buildings pulled tenants away from the old ones. The old ones sat emptier. The cycle tightened. The result is a market with roughly 250 million square feet of total office inventory, one of the largest in the country, serving an economy that no longer needs all of it. Demolition is occasionally proposed as a solution, and a handful of obsolete buildings have been torn down. But demolition is expensive, complicated by asbestos and other hazardous materials in older stock, and it removes a physical asset without generating revenue, so the buildings stay standing. The vacancy numbers stay elevated, and the cycle, which has been running in some form since the mid-1980s, continues. There is roughly 65 million square feet of available office space in Houston right now, enough empty real estate to fill roughly 260 Empire State Buildings. Not all of it is unmarketable, but enough of it is to constitute a real and durable problem. Houston spent the better part of 40 years constructing office inventory on the assumption that the next energy boom would fill it. Some of it got filled, a lot of it didn't, and the buildings constructed during the 1980s oil boom and the early 2010s fracking surge have been competing for the same shrinking pool of tenants ever since. The pandemic didn't create that problem. It just made it impossible to paper over any longer. When half your conference rooms have been empty for 3 years, the quarterly report stops making the argument for you. Remote work finished what the oil bust started. When the pandemic hit in 2020, Houston lost approximately 361,000 jobs between February and April of that year. The energy sector took the hardest blow. Global oil demand collapsed almost overnight as travel stopped and economies shut down. The city eventually recovered those jobs, but the structure of work had shifted in ways the raw employment numbers don't capture. Hybrid schedules became standard across corporate America. Workers who previously commuted 40 minutes to downtown Houston suddenly had the option to work from home 3 or 4 days a week. For suburban Houston employees who had always found the downtown commute tedious, this was not a difficult adjustment. Many never returned to a 5-day downtown schedule, and their employers, paying for large offices that were half occupied on a typical Tuesday, began examining their real estate footprints with a new and uncomfortable clarity. The pattern that followed was consistent. Large companies downsized their spaces at lease renewal rather than mid-contract, which is why the vacancy numbers kept rising through periods when the broader economy was performing reasonably well. Technip Energies moved into a new Houston building in 2024, 171,600 square feet, representing a reduction of 42% from their previous footprint, a company simultaneously growing its Houston presence and shrinking its real estate by nearly half. That dynamic repeated across the market throughout 2024 as annual negative absorption of 1.2 million square feet erased prior gains. The square footage companies were giving back wasn't going back on the market at higher rents. It was just going back on the market, adding to an inventory that was already too large. National office visitation data from Placer.ai showed that as of mid-2025, office foot traffic across the U.S. was still roughly 37% below 2019 levels. Houston led all major metros with an 8.3% year-over-year increase in office visits in May 2025. Genuine progress, though it's worth noting how far below pre-pandemic norms the starting point was. The underground city nobody talks about. There's a reason you can walk through parts of downtown Houston during a weekday and see almost no one on the sidewalks, even when tens of thousands of people are technically at work in the buildings around you. They're underground. The Houston Tunnel System is a network of climate-controlled pedestrian walkways running approximately 6 miles beneath downtown, connecting 95 city blocks. The concept dates to the 1930s, when former Texas governor and humble oil founder Ross Sterling, inspired partly by the tunnel system beneath New York's Rockefeller Plaza, built a tunnel connecting 2 of his buildings beneath Fannin Street. An entertainment entrepreneur named Will Horwitz followed, connecting 3 of his vaudeville and movie theaters underground to save on air conditioning costs. As the office construction boom of the 1960s and 1970s expanded downtown Houston, more and more buildings added tunnel connections to the growing network, and the system evolved into what exists today. Today, the tunnel connects office towers to hotels, banks, restaurants, food courts, dry cleaners, barbershops, pharmacies, and retail. It is open on weekdays from roughly 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and then it closes entirely. On weekends, it is shut. On holidays, it is shut. The entire ecosystem of underground retail and food service runs on an office worker schedule because office workers are its only real reason for existing. This is a revealing illustration of how downtown Houston was designed to function. The logic of the tunnel is perfectly suited to a city where everybody drives to work, parks in a garage, goes underground to avoid the heat and humidity, gets lunch, and leaves at the end of the day. It was never designed for a mixed-use pedestrian neighborhood with evening and weekend life. When office occupancy drops, the tunnels empty out, and so does the street-level world above them. The absence of pedestrians on Houston's downtown sidewalks isn't just a function of weather. It's a function of design. The people are there. They're just 20 feet underground, and they go home at 5. Hurricane Harvey and the flood problem nobody solved. Any honest accounting of what's happening in Houston has to include the flooding. On August 25th, 2017, Hurricane Harvey made landfall as a Category 4 storm near Rockport, Texas, and then, crucially, stalled over southeast Texas for 4 days instead of moving inland. Some areas received more than 50 inches of rain over that period. Cedar Bayou in Houston recorded 51.88 inches of rainfall, a new North American record for a single storm system. The Harris County Flood Control District estimated that 1 trillion gallons of water fell on the county in 4 days, and that approximately 70% of the county flooded by at least 1.5 feet of water. Roads became rivers. Neighborhoods that had never flooded before went under. More than 160,000 homes flooded. Harvey caused an estimated $125 billion in damage, which put it in a tie with Hurricane Katrina as the costliest tropical cyclone on record in the United States at the time. 103 people in Texas died from storm-related causes. Harvey didn't just damage buildings and displace families. It exposed how Houston's growth model, covering vast stretches of flat coastal prairie and wetland with concrete and asphalt, had made the flooding problem dramatically worse over decades. Natural sponges like the Katy Prairie, which once absorbed enormous amounts of rainfall before it could run off into the bayous, had been paved over as suburbs expanded west. The water that previously soaked into the ground had nowhere to go except into neighborhoods, roads, and living rooms. Harris County passed a $2.5 billion bond in 2018 for flood mitigation, and the federal government allocated over $2 billion for housing assistance. Floodplain regulations were tightened. New restrictions on construction in flood-prone areas were put in place. Infrastructure projects began at an unprecedented pace and have continued since. Progress has genuinely been made. Bayous have been widened, detention basins expanded, and some of the most vulnerable homes bought out by the county. But the tension between Houston's insistence on outward growth and its flat, flood-prone geography has not been fundamentally resolved. Flooding risk remains a real and persistent consideration for any company or family deciding whether to make a long-term investment in a city where a single stalled storm system can put 70% of a county underwater in 4 days. The suburbs won. For all the talk about downtown's challenges, it's worth being direct about where Houston's population actually went. The answer is not very far. It just spread out horizontally, rather than concentrating vertically. The metro area didn't lose people. Downtown did. The Houston metro area has been among the fastest growing in the country for years, driven by domestic migration from high-cost states and international immigration. The suburbs of the Woodlands to the north, Sugar Land to the southwest, and Katy to the west have each grown into substantial communities with their own office parks, retail corridors, healthcare facilities, and economic activity. For many Houston residents, these suburban centers are effectively their city, the place where they work, shop, eat, and spend their free time. Downtown is somewhere they drive to for Astros games or concerts, if they go at all. Companies that might once have located in the central business district have instead clustered in places like the Energy Corridor, along I-10, the Galleria area along Loop 610, and the West Chase District, all outside downtown, all closer to where the workforce actually lives. This suburban office market has outperformed downtown during the current downturn. The Woodlands submarket posted 419,000 square feet of positive office absorption in Q2 2025. The Katy Freeway West and Energy Corridor submarkets have consistently been among the strongest performers in the metro throughout the recent vacancy surge. Between 2018 and 2024, the Houston metro area attracted 31 new corporate headquarters, including Chevron, which relocated from California, and Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, which moved its operations to Suburban Spring in 2022. That puts Houston in a four-way tie for fourth nationally for corporate relocations during that period, behind Dallas, Austin, and Nashville. The city, broadly defined, is not failing. Downtown specifically is struggling to articulate a compelling reason why a company should choose a central business district address over a suburban campus with easier parking, lower rents, and shorter commutes for most of the workforce. That's a harder sales pitch than it sounds, and the office market data suggests a lot of companies have heard it and made their choice. The doom loop question. Analysts and city officials have spent the past several years debating whether Houston's downtown faces what urban economists call a doom loop, the self-reinforcing cycle in which vacant offices lead to fewer workers downtown, which drives closures of restaurants and retailers that depended on office traffic, which makes downtown less attractive to tenants, which produces more vacancies. San Francisco and parts of Portland and Chicago have been cited as examples of cities potentially caught in this dynamic, and it's a question that Houston is beginning to take seriously. Houston's restaurant scene saw significant closures in 2024, with downtown lunch traffic described as persistently soft. Many closures involved restaurants that had specifically built their business model around the office lunch crowd and weekday foot traffic, a model that worked well when buildings were full 5 days a week and stopped working when they were half occupied on a rotating hybrid schedule. The practical consequence is fewer reasons to be downtown during off-peak hours, which is the kind of thing that discourages residential investment, which is the kind of thing that perpetuates the problem. Houston City Controller Chris Brown put the tax implications plainly. Office buildings are enormous assets on the property tax rolls. If their values decline because sustained vacancy makes them less profitable, the property tax base contracts. That affects city revenues, school funding, and the city's ability to invest in the infrastructure improvements that might make downtown more attractive. It's a feedback loop that doesn't require catastrophe to cause real damage. It just requires enough years of inertia. Some Houston observers push back on the doom loop framing, pointing to population growth, corporate relocations, and the fact that Houston workers are returning to offices at higher rates than most major U.S. cities. That last point is true. Houston has consistently ranked near the top of major metros for return-to-office rates, partly because the energy industry culture has always emphasized in-person collaboration, and partly because the city's suburban layout means there are fewer neighborhoods close enough to downtown to make working from home feel like a genuine lifestyle upgrade. Whether the city avoids a doom loop or slides into one gradually likely depends on decisions not yet made about converting vacant buildings, building downtown residential density, and investing in the transit and walkability infrastructure that might make the core genuinely attractive to people who don't have to be there. What's actually being done? The most discussed solution for Houston's downtown vacancy problem is conversion, taking old, unmarketable office buildings and repurposing them as apartments or mixed-use residential projects. It's a concept that has worked in other cities, and Houston has some structural advantages that make it more feasible there than in other places. Land costs are lower than in coastal cities. Texas lacks some of the regulatory barriers that add time and cost to conversions elsewhere, and the city has shown a willingness to fast-track permitting for projects that address specific urban needs. There are genuine challenges, however. Older office buildings were often designed with large, deep floor plates that don't translate well into residential layouts. Apartments generally need windows on at least one side, and the center portions of wide office floors can end up as unusable dead space. Asbestos and other environmental hazards in buildings constructed before the 1980s add significant remediation costs before a conversion can even begin. And the economics of any conversion depend heavily on interest rates, construction costs, and the confidence of lenders that Houston's downtown residential market is deep enough to absorb new supply. Several conversion projects have been announced in downtown Houston in recent years. Whether they get completed and whether they generate the kind of street-level residential life that could change the character of downtown over time remains to be seen. Converting a building is the relatively straightforward part. Convincing people who own houses in Katy or the Woodlands to instead rent an apartment downtown, in a city that was entirely designed around car ownership, is a much larger cultural and logistical shift. It is possible, other cities have done it, but it requires downtown to offer something compelling enough to offset everything that suburban Houston already provides. The other significant piece of the puzzle is the Texas Medical Center, located just south of downtown. The TMC is the largest medical complex in the world by number of facilities, employing over 100,000 people and generating roughly $25 billion in economic output annually. It is one of the most stable economic anchors any American city could have, operating largely independent of oil prices, remote work trends, and office market cycles. The growth happening in biomedical research and life sciences around the TMC represents a different version of the Houston economy, less volatile, less dependent on commodity cycles, and increasingly connected to the global research enterprise in ways that could sustain downtown adjacent development for decades. Houston isn't dying. That's worth being direct about. The metro area is growing, companies are relocating there. The Texas Medical Center is one of the most powerful economic anchors of any American city, and the energy industry, for all its cycles, is not going anywhere soon. By almost any metro-level measure, Houston is a city that's doing well. The specific problem is downtown, and downtown's problem is decades in the making. The city that spread itself across 667 square miles is now discovering what the bill looks like. When office workers have the option to work from home or in a suburban campus closer to where they live, the case for downtown gets harder to make. When the buildings that anchor your tax base and your lunch-hour restaurant economy sit more than a quarter empty, the ripple effects reach further than just the landlords losing rent. They reach the tax rolls, the school districts, the small businesses that bet on office foot traffic, and the streets that feel quiet even on a Wednesday morning. What happens next depends on whether Houston is willing to reimagine downtown as something other than a destination people drive to for work and leave at dusk, and whether the political will exists to make the investments that transformation requires. It would mean building residential density, extending transit, and accepting that the suburban model that built Houston's wealth may not be the model that sustains its urban core. Some cities have managed exactly that kind of reinvention. Whether Houston does is one of the more genuinely interesting urban questions playing out in America right now. If you found this useful, hit the like button. It helps more people find this kind of content. And if you want to keep following stories like this one about cities, economies, and the decisions that shape both, subscribe. New videos go up regularly.